Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the book launch for the Practical Philosophy of AI Assistance. My name is Andrea, and I'll be your MC today. We are also joined by the two authors, Suman and Peter. So before we start, let's go through the housekeeping rules. Please keep your camera and microphone off for the entire duration of the event. Please post your questions via the chat room, and as a disclaimer, this webinar will be recorded and the recording may be shared publicly online. So just to walk you through what's going to happen through this book launch, we will start with a discussion on AI assistance, followed by a Q&A section. So the first question is, why is it important for an AI assistant to perceive and recognize its environment?
The second wave of AI is generally been described as statistical inference. If I have a bunch of observations X, I want to infer an unseen or latent variable Y. If I see the pixels of a person's face, I want to infer the identity of that face. If I see a trend in time, I want to up until time t, I want to infer a future state. And so we got very good at this question of statistical inference. This is essentially the realm of machine learning, eventually deep learning, statistical analysis, and so forth. And we had a large number of mechanical device capabilities able to support that. The third wave of AI, though, is what I would say more AI in the wild. Can you go into unforeseen circumstances where you didn't know ahead of time what the problem was, and I would say get the gist of things and hopefully do the right thing. And so to me, this is going beyond the question of how can I classify certain entities, but can I recognize various things in the environment in general? It's the environment that counts now. In order to be able to get the gist of things, I must be able to recognize the things in the environment in order to make them to go forward. And then recognition becomes a question, not just, I think, at some level, we talked a lot in the book about the difference between, say, recognition and the act of classification. If I know I'm looking for rabbits in the room, that is one thing. I can build a rabbit classifier and look for that. If I walk in the room and don't know necessarily what I'm expecting to see, and a rabbit appears, and I can recognize it's a rabbit, that's a different thing in terms of just the number of possible things I could classify. Once you can imagine running an enormous amount of classifiers, and that would be one way of doing it. Another way to do it is essentially some sort of indexing frame. But the idea is that I could recognize almost or detect almost anything in a large number of possible things. But then recognition goes beyond just the presence or absence of a particular entity, but more of a description of that entity. I recognize the identity as having certain attributes, certain affordances, certain relationships to other things. And at that point, it becomes a richer and richer representation of the environment. And hopefully, if our goal is to do things, then that would provide for a more nuanced way of essentially coming up with what's known as a policy, the ability to take the state of the environment and hopefully be able to do the right thing. So I think if our goal is to get the gist of things and do the right thing, part of the gist comes from recognition itself of things in the environment. Suman, your thoughts?
Yes, I think as before, I'll mull some of the terms he used. Doing the right thing, I think, is where you ended. And that's notoriously a slightly slippery proposition. I suppose the main point that comes to my mind is that the environment is available to us cognitively. In some sense, the idea of recognition, the idea of being able to identify an entity and then to be able to describe a set of entities within an environment is partly what our cognitive abilities are already geared towards. And that raises an interesting question about whether one conceives of the third phase of AI as replicating what we do at some level already, or whether it is in fact doing something quite different by way of recognizing the environment and putting those relations and descriptions, the gist of it, together. And that's where I think the right thing kicks in. To some degree, how we design the system would depend on what we conceive of as the right thing. Whereas an individual human presence in an environment is not necessarily guided by a purpose. It doesn't necessarily know what is right or wrong. And that seems to me an important consideration, possibly from a technological point of view, the idea of fulfilling a purpose, having the right thing achieved, is a kind of preconceived first principle. And how recognition and the environment are understood is corollary to that idea, whereas the human presence at a cognitive level is not necessarily so. So then I start thinking about errors. It seems to me that doing the right thing, if you know what that is, makes the idea of error relatively unimportant. If you achieve the right thing, you have succeeded. Whereas in human reckonings of cognition and action thereby, the right thing is often diffuse and unclear, so one tends to make errors. And errors are possibly a preset dimension of our understanding of an environment. Errors are necessary at various levels. So I'm quite interested, and I think there's scope for us to discuss this further maybe in the future. The role of error, how important is error to our understanding of an environment and an entity, and the perspective, and therefore objectives that can be placed. Yeah, I'm sure you can come back to that, Peter. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Right. So I think maybe I'll just quickly comment on that. The right thing is obviously an interesting question. There is this idea that reward is not enough, but the environment is critical. So one approach to the right thing is I have a reward function. I have an entity whose task is to achieve certain things, and reward will be given based on how well it's able to achieve certain things. And so in this regard, reward is a somewhat, arbitrary thing. It is more and more believed, though, that reward is not enough. If you do not put these entities into richer and richer environments, that they will not learn the types of things that we hope for them to learn, which is essentially the gist of things. So I would argue that the right thing is more to somewhat arbitrary from a learning perspective. We could say the reward is achieve, accumulation of wealth, survival itself could be viewed as a reward, but that's only one element of the thing. I think the real question is, do these things have a stronger sense of the environment itself? And to your point, errors are in an interesting perspective. The mistakes that it makes is the ability to make mistakes and possibly learn from them, I think, is more interesting than just blindly learning to recognize things. Not only did I make a mistake, but why was that a mistake? How did I learn? How can I learn from that mistake? What do the mistakes tell me about the world? I think these are interesting questions as well. So I think recognition of itself may be more important than the actual reward or right thing afterwards. So at the end of the day, I think it may be a more intriguing question at the end of the day.
I mean, just getting back to that recognition, the term itself, is it recognized in the sense we think of people recognizing? So, for instance, I might want to recognize faces. If I go out in the street, there are a lot of faces passing by. I recognize them at quite different levels.
Certainly.
To some, I can familiar face, I know that better. Some are less so. Some are a kind of blur. There are lots of different faces, so I make choices and so on. And it's possible that this process is driven by some kind of objective, a reward function, like dealing with the world I'm in. Or it may not, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And it's quite possible that having gone through this process of cognating my environment, so to speak, and therefore recognizing at quite different levels, I might have realized that I should have paid more attention to that person because he was a pickpocket and he picked my pocket. So it's made an error in not focusing on that person. But that's kind of endemic part of how we set up social systems. So I wondered whether recognition is tagged in terms of how we set up social systems, or is it a more peaceful, piecemeal thing, or is it a more holistic thing that we want to cognate everything in fully, yeah, richer, as you said, or do we actually need both error and rewards? as a kind of template?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we're dealing with a limited computational budget. You
Mm,
cannot tend to all things. You
yeah.
cannot uh, hope to have a comprehensive understanding of things. So the question is given that I have a limited budget of what I can compute, what
Mm.
is the most, should I say, salient or useful way of attending to things in order to accomplish some sort of overall task?
So there is an accomplishment there. It
There's an
has to
idea of
accomplish it.
accomplishment, yeah. It is very hard to build these systems without the idea of
Mm,
being able to judge the outcome of their actions, if you
exactly.
would, right? So without that guide, it's hard. But to some extent, just the open-ended capacity to analyze things. So a lot of the recent work in AI
Mm,
is question of no longer having labeled data, but data that is open-ended. Can I simply, predict the next word in a sentence? Can I sample from a large distribution? And it seems that the side benefits of being able to do these open-ended tasks are themselves valuable. So there may be secondary values that we get from just being able
mm,
to recognize things, if you will. And once I have got those capacities, what can I do with those representations that I've built up through that process? So the initial, accomplish this may be less important than the capacity to do the things needed to achieve those accomplishments, and in so doing, creating richer and richer representations which have other
mm.
capabilities. So I think that's the trend that we're seeing now.
So just to get that clear, would it be fair to say that open-endedness or a richer environment apprehension, as you say,
Right.
is mainly an anticipation of reuse? That it's
Yes.
a kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
So one could say that it is a matter of repurposing or having the ability to repurpose rather than simply fulfill a given purpose.
Right. The initial task at hand may not be the ultimate utility of these
Mm.
accomplishments. Is the point I would make. Yeah, I think you're right on that. Andrea, should we go to the next question,
Great,
or yeah?
great, thank you. Moving to the next question. So, until recently, linguistic communication has been a definitive human ability. Do AI assistants have this ability now, and what are the implications?
Shall I start again, Suman, or do you want to
Yes, true.
roll
I
ahead?
think yes, it goes by turns, I think. Yeah.
We'll go by turns. Okay. Yeah. So communication, I think, is obviously an interesting arrangement. In our book, we discussed a little bit the role of communication in our development. We looked at the work of Michael Tomasello, who makes the argument that what drove a lot of our development might have been this idea of cooperation. And cooperation has its advantages. If societies can cooperate, there are certainly benefits from that. And an element of cooperation is communication. And the argument that he makes is that communication allowed initially for three basic things. Can I request assistance? Can I offer assistance? And maybe the third thing I think is an interesting area was to establish conceptual common ground. And I think that is the area that I'm mostly interested in. Is an AI agent today could certainly do a number of things, but its conceptual common ground with a user or other elements in society would be limited, may not have any conceptual common ground at all, for that matter, other than whoever the designers of that AI generated. But if the idea that cooperation is premised on conceptual common ground, that forces an AI to live to some extent in our world, and maybe us in their world, if you will. And I think that's an important element. And part of that goal is a necessity to make explicit what may only be implicitly known. The AI agents, by having to communicate, must encapsulate whatever knowledge it has in forms that can be communicated in a very terse manner. And to me, I think that is a forcing function to make certain things more clear, more concise, and essentially something that lends itself to reasoning as opposed to purely inference level capabilities. So I view communication as a necessary tool to create common ground, but also to force as a forcing function for representations that ultimately become essentially sort of containers of knowledge containers, representations that can be manipulated in certain ways. So I view communication as very important in that regard. Suman, would you care to comment?
Yes, I think for me, it'll be an understatement to say that communication is very important. I think communication is constitutive of how we apprehend the world and ourselves. So moving on, we had rather an interesting discussion, quite a fun one on Tomasello, I think. So I wouldn't revisit that. Possibly the book itself will take readers there. But if we think of communication at its most obvious level from a human point of view, that is really a very complex science system. It might be an oral science system, a verbal science system, which is perhaps possibly more complex than the written one in various ways, because conversations tend to do unexpected things at the level of science. The ostensible science system, such as words and syntax, when we talk to each other, we use ellipses, for instance, we jump them. And there are lots of other bits of signification which are not systematized, which play in that system, which has probably made actual human-machine communication a very complicated business. It has taken a great deal of effort and still quite a lot of unknown factors for there to be even a simulation of seamless communication, because our communication is at various levels in terms of its semantics, not logical. So that's certainly very important. It's more than that. It's possibly connected to the fact that communication does carry errors. So illogicality is an intrinsic element of communication. And the question that arises then is, to what purpose is a AI communicating system designed? Is it designed as an intervention? Is it designed purely as a response mechanism to our communications to fit in? Is it designed, going back to the previous question, for a purpose? And communications often are not within their science systems to discernible purposes. And the fact that I came and said, "Hello, Peter, horrible day, isn't it?" It's a matter of registering something other than the purpose. It is a kind of mode of recognition, really. And in many ways, recognition is conveyed within that statement. And yet that statement is so minimalistic that its semantics itself doesn't convey the various things that happen in my saying that. So is it important? It's important insofar as we use or integrate with systems, and insofar as those systems tend to, and I suppose that's one way of looking at AI, anticipate how we integrate with them. And beyond that, I think it's a matter of really looking at things that Peter and I were beginning to look at now, how in terms of the LLM architecture and how embedding works and so on. So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions there, which I'm still just beginning to think about. Yeah.
I'll just comment quickly on that. Oh, just one quick word on that.
Yeah.
I think, to your point, the communication that we have enjoyed ourselves as a species has created a level of sophistication that in of itself is a different world, if you will. And by right now, I'd say most communication with AIs is mostly transactional. Piece of information needs to be transmitted from A to B, but the actual idea that the AIs themselves could luxuriate in our form of discourse and evolve appropriately, that to me is very interesting. And then we've obviously seen through the preliminary work on LLMs and so forth that exposure to this rich world that we have does create more and more sophisticated capabilities. So to Suman's point, I think we're just at the beginning of where this could go.
Yeah, and just a little thing to add to that. In a way, the way Peter is phrasing this, that AI might luxuriate, for instance, it seems to suggest that there is some kind of agency involved in the ability to adapt to communication. And in many ways, communication is an articulation or a clarification or puts a perspective on our notion that we are acting agents at some level at various points. The question of agency is an interesting one, both how agency is constituted through a science system and how it is decoded as agency, and then sets of chains of events, acting events. So in a way, I suppose at the kind of hovering question in everyone's mind is that, does AI have an agency? Is that really a conceivable idea? Is there an AI system which is mainly facilitating, enhancing, working in the interstices of our agencies? Or if one begins to think of AI as sort of luxuriating in the communicative facilities and capacities that we have, then one is beginning to attribute, possibly slightly anthropomorphically, an agentic behavior. And I think there is much to be unpacked in our assumption that that is even conceivable.
Thank
And there
you.
you go for the next question.
Yeah, can AI assistants understand and explain the world and share their insights with us?
Right. So, in the book, we looked at this question. I mean, I think a nice way of thinking about explanation is essentially a form of reasoning of sorts. So at least that's one aspect of explanation. Um, often when people talk about AI and explanation, they're talking about the idea that an AI has come up with some sort of inference or decision or output. And the question is, how did you come up with that particular inference so that we can know, can it be trusted? Is this something? And that is one way of looking at what AI could do. I'm a little bit more interested in AI as a tool for understanding the world. And so part of that game is this question of reasoning. I think a nice way of thinking about reasoning is that reasoning makes explicit what is implicitly known. You may know a series of facts, but putting them together makes it explicit as to why something has happened. So that's one way of looking at reasoning. There is an interesting paper that we looked at, is that abduction is explanation and prediction is deduction. Or maybe it's reversed. I'm not quite sure what it was. But the idea basically is that can you not only see if given a phenomenon, so a prediction would be given a series of knowledge or set of knowledge that you have in an initial state, what would happen next? That's one thing. Another argument is, if I see a phenomenon, could I come up with a chain of events that would have caused that to happen, and then get to the question of causality. I think that's an interesting perspective, but that sort of implies that you are essentially manipulating knowledge that you have. Another level of explanation might be the question of, the argument is that scientific discovery takes place at the periphery of our knowledge. And so for a long time, AI has been trying to say, well, if we can represent the knowledge that we have, that would open up the doors for essentially increasing that knowledge at the periphery and go to the element of discovery. And that, I would say, has been a desire. I don't think it has actually happened in a significant way yet. So that's something to be hoped for. So now we're talking about essentially explanation as a form of science. I would say AI has been mostly relegated to data visualization and maybe certain regression tasks that are challenging, but not necessarily at coming up with new hypotheses regarding new forms of knowledge that could be true based on phenomena that we observe. And so I think that is really the goal. I mean, we are starting to see how AI can do a kind of implicit science. The AlphaFold, given a set of proteins, produce the shape of that molecule, or sort of set of component parts. Can we deduce the shape? Given a current state, can we deduce the weather patterns to come? These are things that require certain pieces of knowledge that seem to be now captured, but it's hard to articulate as to why these things happen. Maybe not. Maybe something is too complex to articulate. But to me, I think the goal of AI as an explanation is to essentially move beyond this idea of just saying why I said this, but coming up with hypotheses as to why certain phenomena occur. The last thing I would put on there, and we did a little bit in the book, is this idea of creative copying, and that being so we as people have seen that birds can fly. So the big jump there is that flight is something that could be done. Now, it turns out that we don't have the mechanisms ourselves to fly like a bird flies, but once we know that the objective is there, can we come up with a method for flight, such as balloons and planes and so forth? So to me, I think that is something that we have enjoyed as a species that most other species have not been able to enjoy as such. And as such, I think that AI could play a role in that creative copying. The hard part may be just realizing that something is there is a possible target out there, and then how to achieve that. And then we go a little bit more towards invention. So I know I've walked around a little bit, but invention, science, and explanation, that's where I see the role of AI in explanation going forward. Suman?
Yes, I'm not quite sure that I can put it as eloquently as Peter did, what AI is going towards. But there are, I think in the book we went through that. I started from a much simpler point with explanations. I think I looked at a rather fun interview by Richard Feynman on asking why. So I think he went through a process like, we have this statement, Aunt Minnie fell down and broke her hip. And you could ask why. And then you could go in various directions. You could say, why did she fall? Because there was ice. Why does ice make you fall? Because it's slippery. Why is ice slippery? Or you could go in the direction of, why did she break her hip? Because she had some kind of bone condition and so on. So the question why, and in a way, Peter was using that why quite eloquently. We ask why. So I think I'm saying the same thing that Peter is saying, but in different words, in words that are more familiar in a philosophical conversation. What does asking the question why entail? Asking the question why is often quite different from asking the question what, for instance, or where, because what and where have very definite answers, whereas every answer to a why seems to just invite another why. It's kind of what children do. Why? Why did that? The egg broke. Why did the egg break? And so on. You can carry on with the why. And that, to an extent, was Feynman's point that scientific, or indeed any kind of engagement with knowledge, is a matter of very persistently, with an almost childlike persistence, asking why. So why seems to be a question that keeps opening up, pushing the boundary for explanations, because explanations are expanding features of knowledge itself. And then the question is, where are the boundaries? So I suppose with a question like what, the boundary is very clear. You can answer it. There's a definite answer to a what, usually. But why seems to lead towards some kind of final boundary. We are explaining the world for some purpose that is appointed beyond the immediate circumstance, and we can keep ruling out that why till we get there, which I suppose brings us back to the things we were talking about. Is it possible for an AI to have a final boundary, or final boundary is appointed within our social and communicative structures rather than situationally engaged to reach the reward? Is there a final question and a final answer in terms of which every why we ask is sort of conditioned? So explanation is a big issue. And I suppose the question would always be explaining to whom and why. So I'm less clear, I suppose, still. I'm sure Peter will explain it to me one of these days.
Yeah.
What, how AI
will explain the world.
sort out explanation.
Or the AI will explain it to you for my behalf, right? Andrew, how about we go to the last question?
Yes, so for better or for worse, AI will become a participant in what we call a civil society. What are the prospects in this regard?
Well, this is, I think, Suman and I, as you said, we don't agree on we agree on some things, but not all things. And I think certainly here is where we might depart ways to some extent. But let me put forward an argument, given our current malaise, if you will. My general feeling is that, in the book, we talked about this ideas of, the civil society is predicated on some set of norms, rules, practices, and so forth, and that these entities, these rules, norms, and norms need to be supported or can be supported in a way for a civil society to function. You could use AI as a way of searching for deviancy from these norms. I think that's certainly a surveillance society would certainly allow for that, and we're not too far from that in many parts of the world. I would argue, though, that it could also be used as a means to help our citizens who may want to support these norms and so forth. I mean, I think if In my general feeling is in a civil society, one has access to clean water. If you drink directly from the sewer, you will get sick. I think right now, from a social media perspective, many of us are drinking directly from the sewer, and there are certain issues associated with that. So I could imagine an AI like being some sort of filter or some sort of entity that could help if the individual wants it, not necessarily maybe not necessarily do, but could it be as a guide to help people sort of deal with the challenging world of ideas that we have. So that's one way of thinking about a civil society or an AI agent. Another possibility I see is that what I would see positive is there's always been this hope or dream that technology is the answer towards leveling income inequality or essentially reducing cost of living and so forth. Now, it hasn't always gone that way, and generally speaking, the argument has always been, the people with capital are the ones who can exploit technology to the best purposes. But it can be a democratizing process as well. It could be a situation where an AI, if suitably developed by various entities with goodwill, could, I imagine, create a situation where cost of living is reduced. Individuals essentially have greater income equality. And to me, I think that is another element of creating a more civil society, if you will. So those would be the two facets I see as being possible realms with which an AI could be a boon to our existence. Suman?
Yes, I'd like to share. In fact, I do share, I think, Peter's idealism in this respect. Uh, if, if one is idealistic about this, that good can come from it. Yes, of course, good, if insofar as possible, should be cultivated and nurtured and pushed. I suppose I'd pause, as I usually do, on words again. The word there was participant. AI participant. As you described it, Peter, it seems to be it's a facilitator for such notions of civility and norms of goodness as we can envisage in given circumstances. And you have mentioned some of these circumstances, like the cost of living crisis, for instance, or endless conflicts. Um, these are our kind of problems, and facilitation can happen in any direction. Facilitation can be both for the norms we like, the norms we disagree with, and there are many of those. It's not about liking. And a technological system can be put to all those purposes. So there isn't necessarily a civil society direction of goodness that is envisageable outside our rather complex attribution of norms and so on. So I think much hinges around the notion of participation, because again, I think I can sniff in there a kind of slightly anthropomorphizing agentic attribution to the notion of AI, which I'm skeptical of, while I share the vision of, after all, our book is about the practical philosophy, and we have an idea of practical good at the bottom of it. We do think the practical good should be somehow reached towards the public good. But what that consists in is obviously contested. The part that AI will play in that is even more contested. So much to thrash out there. And not just individual perceptions, but the individual perceptions within the structure of social conditions, which are often organized social conditions, which are legislative and ethical restrictions, and so on. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Suman and Peter, for the interesting conversation on AI assistance. I think we can now move to the Q&A section of our launch. So someone is saying, personally, I'm particularly interested in the subtitle of the book, An Engineering Humanities Conversation. Could you elaborate a bit on that engineering humanities conversation? What is the interplay between those fields in your work?
Well, I can take a stab of that at
Go
that
for it.
because for a change, I think in a way, what we were just doing, trying to thrash out questions, is what that conversation consists in. Peter uses a set of terms conditional to his practical engagement with, let's say, conceiving and manufacturing certain AI systems. And these terms are necessary. They give order to how the technological system is set up. A humanities perspective, however, is not as conceived in terms of a practical application for an affordance to be created. In a way, it's more analytical. So the question from a humanities point of view is, what effect does this have, given that there are these human conditions like speech, writing, culture, and so on. So to some extent, it's a matter of translating terms. Peter uses terms as any engineer would, with the process and realization of an affordance in mind. From a humanities perspective, each of those terms already exist, and they're loaded in various ways, which might not fit the particular purpose that Peter is employing the term for. And I tend to question those. And somewhere in that exchange of conversations, in the translation of terms, I think both sides loosen up a bit. I mean, at least the humanities side begins to see that loading terms in endless complexity and situatedness can deter a certain pragmatist idea of engaging with the world. And the pragmatist idea is important because that's to a great extent how we do engage with the world. And similarly, I think the clarity of an engineering application of terms, a notion that there is a reward, for example, that a reward is an end, or an explanation consists in particular kinds of science, or that recognition is a matter of getting rich data about the environment. All these terms are not as innocent as they might sound within their application, that they can be misconceived, misused, can lead off in different directions, are all too human, in other words. So I think it's that accommodation within trying to translate and understand the terms from an application point of view and from an kind of explanation point of view, an explanation of the human condition, an application for an affordance. Between that, there is a path. And I think the conversation is that path.
Yep. Well,
Yep.
I think obviously Suman is correct in the sense that we are coming from different domains and different mechanisms and different structures, but we are looking at problems that are multifaceted. So obviously from the humanities perspective, things are looked at from a different perspective, from an engineering perspective. But what I think is, there is, great value in terms of purely access to each other's domains. The conversations themselves allow for an understanding of the limitations of the way I see things, or the way I've been, conditioned to operate on, and hopefully vice versa as well. Is that the idea of a computational model associated with a philosophical construct becomes more interesting. So I think the commingling of these worlds does create just raw interest itself as well. But I think maybe the bigger opportunity along these lines is the idea of a conversation leads to directions that I believe neither of us would have anticipated. This is a meandering. The way we've worked it is essentially I would put together a chapter, Suman would comment on that, and then that would pull me off from what I would not. If I were just writing the book by myself, it would be somewhat of a linear thing. From the beginning to the end, I would have known where I would have gone. But unlike that, where our conversation is more of a meandering situation, where I didn't anticipate, I don't think either of us anticipated where the book would go, but by having this sort of this balance between the two of us, we essentially go into areas that neither of us would have probably anticipated by itself. So I think there is a sense of exploration that comes from having people from different domains come together and go down that path. But I think personally, the third thing I would add to that is this idea of conversation itself. Is that while we have, we can directly talk, we can converse via our letters and our emails and our writings, but I would say that throughout this process, I am building up a kind of mental model of what a humanities researcher might think about things. I can almost anticipate at least predict possible thoughts that might come out of it. Having not even if Suman is not in the room, I'm now in that situation where I have that mental model of what would Suman say in these situations. And I think as we build more and more of these mental models in ourselves, we can take advantage of that. I find in my daily work, when I think about the implications of work that we're doing in various situations for various agencies and so forth, having that pantheon of a humanities researcher who I have a mental model for now, I would consider myself obviously be a practitioner of the humanities itself, but I at least can understand or anticipate to some extent where that might go. And I think that's valuable itself. So the more that we can develop these types of conversations, I think we will discover new things. We will go to areas that are unanticipated. We'll create clarity between these domains and enrich them. But also ourselves as individuals, I believe we will benefit through having these mental models of each other built up and go forward. So that's the way I sort of see the advantages of how this interaction works.
Yeah, in fact, let me add to that, because I agree entirely with what Peter said there, and from my side, it works very similarly. But it also crossed my mind as you were saying that, Peter, that in a way, one has conversations because one has some common ground.
Right.
We can't really converse if we don't have registers which meet at some level. So we have been talking about this since 2018, and there was a previous volume, What is AI, which was built on, and we didn't have any particular plan of ending at one point. The conversation drew itself on almost as a kind of autonomous logic. But I suppose the point is that there is a logic, and there is something that we do share. I mean, we don't, for instance, it's written there in somewhere in the introduction, I think, that we don't go for articles of faith, for example. We don't go for very strong convictions which can't be shaken. The idea is that everything should be negotiable. So we have some ground rules which I think have something to do with ideas of logic and reasoning and the importance of evidence. And to some degree, of course, Peter and I are both socialized academically. We have gone through an academic training process in which it seems that, different as our domains are, the principles of academic investigation, reasoning, looking for and articulating arguments are not dramatically different. That in some sense, if I write a research paper in literature and Peter writes a research paper on face recognition, for instance, these are very different domains, but they do share some academic kind of integrity, which we are both socialized into. And to some extent, we are speaking to each other, but the conversation is also outward looking. In that, obviously, Peter writes his piece for me, but we have in mind that this is a piece that anyone can read. So in a way, we are conversing to each other so as to converse with everyone around us and converse with everyone, really, irrespective of domain. And I think that's worth pointing to, that we do share something and we do want to universalize. So we don't want to be stuck in our domains. We think that our domains feed into something universal and something of interest to everyone.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do you think AI systems will need some sort of body to achieve human level intelligence?
So this is the question of the embodiment problem. My general feeling is that well, we've clearly seen the advantages of endless or seemingly endless amounts of data that these agents that are the LLMs, for instance, have been exposed to much of the content on the internet, and that represents a kind of unlabeled data that, by just being able to do simple tasks such as unmasked or masked estimation, has resulted in representations that are very powerful. So I think there are limits to how far that source of knowledge. We may even be getting to the point where we've exhausted what is currently available on the internet, and the question is, well, where's next? And the argument has been, that the real world represents a source of data that could be, significantly. We know that I think a back of the envelope calculation could show that the the information associated with imagery captured by a child in the physical world is, orders of magnitude more than the content on the internet itself. So purely if we build these engines, that the architectures that could continue to absorb knowledge, then an instantiation that is in the physical world represents the next level of data, if you will. So, but that implies that, I could put a camera out there and so forth. But to me, I think that the bigger question is that if I have an entity in the physical world that's actually doing things, not just passively absorbing things, then we start to get this idea once again of cause and effect. And I think at the root of this belief is that the AIs have yet to really come up with what some are calling a world model of and that goes back to the question of explanations. If I don't need to do some sort of complex calculation to realize that if I put a glass of water at the corner, that is a precarious situation. And that's a lot to do with my world model of how the world works, if you will. So I think, although it may not be a true model of how the world works, I think the ability to get a model of how the world works does come from an agent that is exposed to the real world in a way that it can actually do things and not just observe. And this goes back to the question of the do calculus. What happens if I actually do something, not just what happens in general between things? So that gets us question of causality and so forth. So I do believe the embodiment is necessary if we are going to get a world model that comes out of these things that has a sense of causality, not just a statistical understanding of if this happens, that will happen probably. But the question is, if I do this, what would happen? And I think those two elements come together will be the next level of AI that we are hoping for. So yeah, I do believe the embodiment is an important element, purely from the data and the causality perspective. Suman, any thoughts?
Yes, I think there's it's an interesting question, because it clearly shows what we all do to some degree accept, that intelligence is somehow connected with embodiment. And we're not quite clear how that, it depends on how you define intelligence. I suppose to some degree, our definitions of intelligence are contingent on the idea of individuation. This is something that Peter and I were discussing, not in the book, but thereafter, recently, the idea of phenomenal experience, that human beings have a phenomenal experience, which is difficult to conceive of in terms of a system. It has, for instance, we see things from a given point of view at a given moment in a given location. And we process what we see and otherwise sense and offer explanations in terms of that location, that itself. The idea of locatedness seems to be powerfully entrenched in the idea of embodiment, that there is a body is individual, it is somewhere at a given time. And maybe that is a necessary, even absolute predicate for how we simply describe the concept of intelligence, a contested concept as well. So perhaps the idea that intelligence is predicated already in terms of who we are located individuals with physical bodies at given places. And the idea of intelligence is after the fact of that. And in that sense, I suppose gathering data, putting together systems is more a kind of inference given intelligence rather than a realization of intelligence as such. So maybe in a way we have sort of set the game in advance, and embodiment looks like a natural direction because it is conceived as a first principle for understanding intelligence.
And maybe I'll just add to that, once you bring in this idea of phenomenal experience, we start opening up the door to the elephant in the room that we're generally conditioned not to mention, which is obviously the question of consciousness. So David Chalmers has sort of envisioned the question is, how is it possible for an entity to know what it's like to be an entity? The hard problem, which is I don't whether or not we're making any progress towards that, I think is questionable, but it is still the question that one must consider eventually. I think as I go to the conferences themselves now, like say, eyes would roll if you were to mention things like artificial general intelligence, consciousness itself. I think there's a bit of optimism, or I wouldn't, maybe the best word is not necessarily arrogance, but there's a sense that maybe we could start to talk about this. So I don't know where we are right now, but there's a certain enthusiasm that's coming. And I think these conversations would be well suited to that. So embodiment, as Suman said, seems to be part of our intuition, is a necessary thing if we're going to go down that path. But to be determined where that path actually goes, if it goes anywhere.
Yes, if it's the kind of cycle, if you have sort of presumed embodiment, defined intelligence accordingly, and therefore think that embodiment is a required end, if it's the circle we are going through, then we are in a bit of a trap, because we'll never recognize intelligence as being anything other than embodied. And in a way, we'll always go around that oldest of all questions, whether a machine can know. When we talk about communication, we keep asking that. At what point do we attribute a machine as having agentic behavior, being intelligent in some kind of self-intending way? And that will always take us back to the kind of Searle's Chinese room question. An agent,
Right.
it could behave without knowing. Knowing is such a slippery concept. Yes, I think we can keep going around that for a considerable while. And to think that we are there, or even within sniffing distance, or even reachable, would be arrogance, I think.
Arrogance is part of our DNA today. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question. What do you hope readers will take away from the practical philosophy of AI assistance?
I'll start.
Yeah.
Shall I start, or Suman, do you would like to
Yeah,
start?
no, go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, I think if as you go through this exercise, and maybe the benefits that I think both of us have of going through our various careers and so forth, both of us are sort of not near the end, but we sort of down the path, if you will, um, is a sense, I think, of a sense of majesty. What is, the endeavor that we're both looking at here? I take away as a, although we talked about the arrogance of the engineers, certainly there, but there's also a sense of humility, in the sense that every day I come in there with a bright idea of how things are going to work, and by the end of the day, I'm pretty convinced that I was wrong at the beginning of the day. So there's a certain sense of failure that continually comes along with trying to build AI systems, and I would imagine trying to build philosophical constructs that essentially fall apart and are left to the wayside. So failure is part of our game here, but I think there is majesty in the sense that we are part of a relatively interesting phenomena. If you look at the world, the universe for 13 billion years, I would say a bunch of rocks and a bunch of vibrating pieces of energy are certainly fascinating, but it's only up until recently that we see this idea of this concept of the types of intelligence that have created ourselves amongst our society and so forth. And that has, in geological terms, is only a recent event. And now we're going down this path of actually constructing these things in some level of shape or form, whatever they may be, however modest they might be. But I think this is part of a progression, and I think there's a majesty to this progression. And I think that is what I'd like to get out of these types of books, of these endeavors, is this is actually quite an interesting time and an interesting place to be. And can we luxuriate in it, if you will? Suman?
Yes, majesty. I'll go along with majesty, though it's from a slightly different direction. Um, I think the majesty is always in trying to apprehend and systematize the world. So trying to create knowledge systems, as it were. So not AI in itself. And in a way, we started with that, didn't we? The question is not so much how efficient we'll become. The question is that this very large scale concerted effort to create AI systems tells us a great deal about ourselves. And if we didn't make this effort, there are many things about ourselves, about our communicative habits, about our ways of interacting with the world, which we do all the time, but which we don't understand or understand imperfectly. Trying to approximate them in some way tells us, both by the degree to which they overlap, and perhaps more importantly, by the degree to which they don't, something about the way the world works. And for a humanities researcher, that's invaluable, because we need new ways of trying to apprehend the human condition, the way of being in the world, all those big philosophical issues. For that, we need a technology. In a way, we are constantly looking for a technology to clarify ourselves, and this is such a technology. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, both, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Suman and Peter, for the fascinating conversation on AI assistance. We are currently offering the book on our website at 30% discount using the code WSQ0417. Feel free to have a look on our website. If you're interested, you can use the discount code. And thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you in future book launches or scientific publishing.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.